Welcome, everyone. That was a wonderful honor song playing in the background by Lakayton, and appreciate the drumming and the singing from that honor song, Lakayton. I want to say hello and welcome to the inaugural event of the KPU Indigenous Dialogue Series, Perspectives on Indigenization. This series is intended to bring together all members of the Kwantlen community, students, employees, affiliates, and the general public, settlers and Indigenous, to listen to and engage with renowned Indigenous scholars, activists, and leaders. It is our hope that these sessions will help spark productive, genuine discussion and meaningful action as KPU moves towards addressing historical and systemic wrongs, ensuring fundamental rights, and creating a present and future where Indigenous peoples can flourish. At Kwantlen Polytechnic University, we live, work, and study in a region south of the Fraser River on the unceded, traditional, overlapping, and ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. We are especially grateful to the Kwantlen Nation, which graciously shared their name with us. Kwantlen means tireless runner, and that is something we are doing every day. We thank the Kwantlen Nation for sharing their land on which we offer our services as a polytechnic university. I also wish to acknowledge personally that I am speaking from the Southern Gulf Islands on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people that unites the Esquimalt and Songhees peoples as one family. And please, I ask that you reflect on where you are located at this time. We have some great speakers this afternoon, but first I invite you to welcome KPU's Elder-in-Residence Lakayton of the Kwantlen First Nation, who brings us greetings. Lakayton, over to you, my friend, all my relations. Hachka.
It's your turn. Say thank you. Sorry.
My dear one, I really, I'm so apologetic because technology, I can only trust that you hear me. And I want to...
Can you hear us, Steve?
Yes.
I
Okay.
can't hear any of you at all. So I'm just trusting that you can hear what I'm saying. I really look forward for today, and I have to set aside our caring for the world and caring for each other. And thank you, Kwabkom, Archibald, Doctor. I thank you for being with us today, and all those who are on the screen. Don't know who it is yet, but I have to just rely on welcoming everyone to the meeting today and be good with that. So I heard a song playing earlier with my voice on it, and I wasn't sure what that is all about. But today I want to welcome everyone from Kwantlen First Nation territories to all the lower Stalo nations, from Kwantlen down to the ocean, and from Kwantlen up to Boston Bar, Upper Coast Salish as well. The languages of our two peoples were always united with our heart and mind so strongly. And then I strongly believe that we're all walking in the footsteps of our ancestors. We do that because that's the way they taught us to do things. Very carefully, very thought out. We try to understand the world as best we can. And when we see the things happening that affect our generations and those that are forgotten, to those who, fought in a war for our freedom, they did this in a way where it was done through honor system. We carry that out today and try to teach all of our students exactly the same. When I see everyone trying so hard in the universities and trying to achieve your dreams and your goals, so important that you follow through no matter what happens. And you know, your 16 years of education that got you to where you are and your doctrines and to everything that we do together, whether it be from kindergarten all the way up to being a Supreme Court judge. The highest honors amongst our people is also with the elders. We fulfill our roles as best we can with language and still having barriers amongst each other and knowing that humanity, there's still a lot of turmoil out there that is against our people. We don't have to look too far when we look at the Westoughton people up in the interior that are fighting with RCMP and LNG and TMX and Trudeau's pipelines. We don't have to look too far down south and we see the turmoil down south that really affects all North America and South America as well. And to all of those that are in amongst our people today that are very, very caring people, we have leadership upon leadership that tries so hard in our everyday issues. So when we look at the tiniest grandchildren that we have, and we try to envision a world for them that's coming, how are we going to keep teaching them being separated, like people separated? We have to come together with a lot of our teachings, songs, language. We have to keep coming together no matter what we do. And I really admire Joanne's role in what she does for the Stalo nations as a whole, but not only Stalo nation, but the world. And there's a lot of times in our matriarchs' lives that people don't take it upon themselves to listen to what is being said from the heart. And from the heart and mind that the matriarchs keep trying our best. I'm going to do heartbeat song because the heartbeat song, it blesses everything that flies in the air that has a heartbeat. It blesses everything that walks on land that has heartbeat. Our food sources, everything that swims in our oceans and streams and lakes has a heartbeat. And everything inside the ground, underneath the earth that has heartbeat. We're all united by that heartbeat. And so when I do this, I don't want to take up too much more of your time because I know how time is so important for all of you today. And so I'm going to do this now, heartbeat song. And when I'm finished, I'm going to just say Haitsapka to all of you and wish you all a happy day. And we're still trying our best to get sound here, so I'm only relying on trust. So from my family to your family to all the families, from all the families in Quattro First Nation, thanking all of you and the 200 participants that are online today. I welcome all of you to what is being done through Quattro Polytechnic University today. Thank you. I should honor you. I should for everyone. Have a wonderful day together and hear those words and have a great Christmas and the end of this year as well from our family. I should honor you.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, hand it over to
Back
our
to me.
leaders at KPU.
Thank you. And thank you as always, Lakayton. Thank you, Cheryl. Your words mean so much to us. They mean a lot and deeply appreciated. The Heartbeat song, even though we are at a distance here, it brings us closer to everyone and to you. The fire in the background I can see on the screen makes me feel warm as well. And I think the introduction that you have given, I just know that our participants really appreciate this. And so on behalf of everyone, Aitchka, thank you so much for opening our conference this afternoon. Thank you so much. I'm now going to move forward. I wish to acknowledge that today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Violence against women and on the basis of gender is a concern both in Canada and all around the world. In connection to this, we must all reflect on the report and subsequent awareness and education campaign of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls that was released in June of 2019. And I think that is so important for us to recognize today as the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. I'm honored to now introduce my two colleagues on the core planning team for this event. While there are many others working behind the scenes for whom we are truly grateful, Natalie Wood-Weens and Dr. Romy Kozak have been key to organizing this event. This event could not have happened without their leadership. And so first, I am pleased to introduce Natalie Wood-Weens, Manager of Indigenous Services for Students at KPU. Natalie has extensive experience in Indigenous education and has worked with the Indigenous communities throughout the Lower Mainland for over 20 years. Natalie brings to KPU a wealth of knowledge of local First Nations, the BC post-secondary system, and academia. Natalie will be back later to assist us with the question and answer session, which is part of the agenda. And she will also help us close the event. So thank you, Natalie, for all of your great work. And secondly, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Romy Kozak, a faculty member in the English department and part-time director of diversity, who, along with President Davis, co-chairs the President's Diversity and Equity Committee, known as PDEC. And now I turn the virtual microphone over to Dr. Romy Kozak. And thank you so much, Romy, for what you do for the university. And Romy will say a little more about PDEC and introduce President Alan Davis. Over to you, Romy.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Lakaitan. As always, your words are food for thought. Before going further, I would like to briefly acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I thank them as well for sharing these lands on which I live and work. As Steve noted, I am part of the planning group for this event as a result of my work with PDEC. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, PDEC is a broadly representative group of administrators, support staff, faculty, and student representatives who seek to ensure the implementation of KPU's policy on diversity and inclusiveness, and to foster a learning and working environment that supports the fair and equitable treatment of all members of the KPU community. It was actually at a PDEC meeting where the idea for this event initially came up. While most of our meetings consist of reports addressing and offering feedback on issues brought forward by members and guests, and periodically evaluating applications for the PDEC Event Fund, another applications cycle of which is coming up, so take note. At this particular meeting, the group was taking some time to discuss an important article by Adam Gaudry and Daniela Renz that really challenged post-secondary institutions to reflect deeply on what was meant by indigenization, and to commit to a direction that went beyond a tick box, solely inclusion-based model. The committee realized that one step in moving towards what the vision the article sets out of a university that is, quote, fundamentally transformed by the deep engagement with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous intellectuals, and Indigenous knowledge systems for all who attend, maybe to create a broad, high-level public ongoing forum in which Indigenous scholars, activists, and leaders could share their learning with the entire Kwantlen community. I want to acknowledge that PDEC is not alone in our continuing work. Dr. Cardwell has been leading KPU's indigenization efforts at the VP level and with the Indigenous Advisory Committee. The recently formed Task Force on Anti-Racism and the Pride Advocacy Group are starting to embark on very important initiatives, and many programs and events, and indeed the core of our educational work towards intersectional social justice are occurring within our faculties and administrative units on an ongoing basis. I want to especially observe that today's session would not be actually occurring without the hard work of many folks beyond PDEC. As I may not have another opportunity to do so, I would like to thank Steve and Natalie for their dedication in transforming the very preliminary nascent kernel of an idea for this series into a reality, and also recognize the many folks behind the scenes who have pitched in and are currently pitching in to make this event happen. I would also like to thank our amazing keynote speaker and panelists, and also to all of you who are taking the time to tune in. The important work of identifying and dismantling systemic barriers, of fighting against colonialism, white supremacy, racism, misogyny, patriarchy, homo and transphobia, ableism, and other forms of systemic violence, and of ensuring the full and transformative participation of historically excluded and oppressed peoples in the life of the university and our communities. It cannot be done alone. Today's turnout makes me especially hopeful that we can find a path forward together in these efforts. And now, without further ado, I have the honor of introducing someone I was told needs no lengthy introduction, and so I'm happy to oblige. Our moderator for this session, President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Alan Davis. Thank you, and over to you, Alan.
Thanks so much, Romy, and thank you, everybody. Again, echo your comments about all those involved in pulling this together. It is great to see an idea thrown up at PDEC come to fruition. I'm humbled and honored to be in the company on this virtual stage of 4 amazing leaders, starting with Dr. Joanne Archibald, Kwam Wiam, and she is from the Stalo and Statlium First Nations, and she is our keynote speaker, and she's going to talk about what reconciliation means in relation to Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous self-determination, and high-quality education, and how all those who work and study at KPU can be engaged with indigeneity and reconciliation in meaningful ways. After a short break, we'll begin a panel discussion with Dr. Archibald and also KPU's recently installed 3rd Chancellor, Kim Baird Quantiltanot, who is, I'm so happy to have join us today. We also have a member of the KPU Board of Governors, Rhiannon Bennett, and one of our wonderful students who's done so much for indigeneity at KPU, Samantha Jack. These panelists will reflect and offer their perspectives on themes from the keynote and also respond to questions from you, our virtual participants. Dr. Joanne Archibald, Kwam Wiham, is emeritus professor in educational studies at UBC. She was the former Associate Dean of Indigenous Education and the Director of UBC's Indigenous Teacher Education Program. She received a Bachelor of Education from UBC and a Master's of Education and PhD from Simon Fraser University. And over a 45-year educational career, Joanne has been a teacher, curriculum developer, researcher, university administrator, and professor, and she received an honorary Doctor of Laws from Kwantlen Polytechnic University in 2017, and we were so proud that she joined our family. Joanne and I were colleagues many years ago, back in the 1980s, before many of you were born, at the Chilliwack campus of what was then Fraser Valley College, and it's a great joy for me to be connected with her again. In the context of reconciliation that was advocated in the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Joanne will examine the following questions. What does reconciliation mean in relation to Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous self-determination, and quality education? And how can all those who work and study at KPU be engaged with indigeneity and reconciliation in meaningful ways? Please join me in welcoming Joanne Archibald.
Thank you. I am very honored to be asked to share some perspectives today on this very important topic, and I am going to put on my presentation, so I'll do that while I am starting to speak here, and I hope this should all work well. There we go. Thank you for that warm introduction and welcome, and Lakayton and Cheryl. It warms my heart to hear the drumbeat and to hear those meaningful words, those good teachings that create a good atmosphere for us today. And to Alan, thanks for introducing me, and I have those great memories of what was then Fraser Valley College. Wonderful times at that particular college, and a good partnership between UBC and Fraser Valley College at the time. I also acknowledge where I am situated today in Vancouver and am grateful to the Indigenous peoples who have allowed us to live and to work and to study on the traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm going to use a teaching that comes from Tsimlano, the Elder Vince Stogan, Dr. Vince Stogan from the Musqueam community. Tsimlano guided our important work at UBC and elsewhere. And he told us that it is important when we gather together, when we start our work, that we create a warm, welcoming, safe environment for us to be able to listen, to hear each other. And I think of the teaching from the late Kotlacha Simon Baker of Squamish Nation, who said, we need to listen with our 3 ears. Of course, the 2 we hear with, but the one in our heart. And we have to bring our heart and our minds and what we hear and what we see, all of that all together. When Tsimlano worked with us, he asked us to all often form a circle, and we have to kind of use our imaginations right today. That we can imagine we are in a great big room and we are standing in a great big circle. And he said, what's important is that we think about and we receive the support and help from those who have come before us. We can reach back to learn their knowledges, and we can symbolize that. And I'll ask you to do this wherever you're sitting, that we hold our left hand with our palm facing upwards so that we're reaching back, we're asking for help. And when we receive that support and those knowledges through our engagement of learning, we have a responsibility to put those teachings into our everyday lives. And no matter where we work or where we study, it's putting those thoughts into action. Then we have a responsibility to help others, to pass those teachings, those knowledges on to others. And we symbolize that by holding our right hand with our palm facing downwards as we give. So we receive in our left, we give on our right. And if we were standing in a circle, we join hands and give a little squeeze of recognition, and that we would know we are connected in this wonderful circle of sharing, learning, and caring. And it is a circle of responsibility, as Tsimlano said, that there's always room for one more person in this circle. I also learn from children. I spend a fair amount of time with my wee grandchildren. And one time I was working with my grandson on an art craft project when he was 6 years old, only a year ago. And it was a bit hard, and I might have felt a little frustrated. And I said out loud, oh, this is really hard. I don't know if I can do it. And he calls me Sisala, which is grandmother in Halkamelin. And he said, Sisala, you have to do the hard work first. Then maybe it gets easy, but you have to do the hard work first. Well, that was a good lesson for me. And we did the hard work, and we got that project finished. But afterwards, I have often thought about that. What does it mean to do the hard work first? Well, I have reflected on my educational experiences and in relation to understanding my past. Where am I from? Who am I? How has education shaped my perspectives about indigeneity and reconciliation? In essence, it's what's my story? Who I am is also part of a larger critical question about how colonial laws and policies have shaped me, my family, my community, my nation, and of course, many others. This colonial history is difficult emotionally, but it is necessary to understand, how we might move forward with reconciliation. Indigenous peoples in Canada have experienced forms of genocide, assimilation, and racism from colonial laws and policies and approaches such as those listed on this slide. This colonial history is factual, and it has had immense ongoing impact to the current day. Indigenous people today have either lived through these difficult and traumatic experiences or have experienced them through intergenerational family and community connections. This history and impact is Canadian and affects all Canadians in some way. Much has been written about these colonial approaches, and recently more Indigenous people are doing the writing and sharing their perspectives in various ways. I am not going to discuss these particular examples because of time limitations today, but I use these examples to indicate a common thread which runs through them: denial, disruption, and disconnection of Indigenous peoples' self-determination and human rights. Denial, disruption, and disconnection of children to their families, communities, and their nations, to their Indigenous cultures, languages, and values. As educators and members of the Canadian society today, we have inherited this colonial legacy, and it is important that we take time to do the hard work to learn about these colonial approaches, and then to understand the impact on Indigenous peoples, on our environment, and in essence, all of Canadian society. But there is another perspective about colonial impact that I want to discuss next. I am thankful for the resistance and resilience of our dear elders and cultural knowledge holders who kept Indigenous teachings, languages, values, ways of being and knowing in their hearts, minds, bodies, and spirits, so that we can continue their intergenerational resistance to colonialism and engage in revitalization of Indigenous ways of being and knowing. The Stalo elders shown in this photo were part of Kokolitsa Cultural Center group. They were involved in a cultural revitalization project where they documented their stories, traditions, philosophies, and experiences for educational use in school curriculum and for community educational purposes. The elders were in charge of what and how this knowledge was represented. I was fortunate to learn from and work with these elders, but that was only after I was a school teacher. As a child attending public school in the Chilliwack School District, nothing positive was included in the school curriculum about Indigenous people. I was never proud to be Indigenous in school. It was like living in two separate worlds, two different worlds, the world of school and the world of my home and community. And I felt loved and valued in my family and in my community. And I think that's what helped me through and to succeed, in educational systems that had the goal of assimilation. And this form of education really I experienced all through my elementary and high school education. And it also continued through my bachelor's, my master's, and my doctoral degrees. But as a graduate student, I was able to learn about colonial history, which is through my own endeavors. It was never part of the university curriculum, really. But once I learned about this colonial history and the impact, then in my subsequent university teaching, I included colonial history and impact and a critical examination of these so that we could also look at how Indigenous people also resisted forms of colonization. So here we are today, where KPU is sponsoring this dialogue series. And people may ask, why reconciliation? Why now? Reconciliation has roots that go back to various national research commissions and inquiries. So the need for reconciliation is not new. It is part of our past. Indigenous peoples have worked hard to reconcile with their families and communities and their Indigenous knowledge systems. The common thread that runs through the examples which are shown on this slide are self-determination, recognition of human rights, the importance and need for Indigenous knowledges, the need to develop respectful, responsible, ethical relationships, and the importance to work on overcoming injustices that Indigenous people continue to face. So I may want to just highlight a couple of things about these various approaches on this slide. The Indian control of Indian education policy was developed by collective actions of Indigenous people across Canada in response to the federal government's attempt, to get rid of Indigenous rights. And in this particular policy, which I think has influenced education a fair amount over the years, relates to parental involvement and responsibility, local control, and using Indigenous culture, values as an important part of educational approaches. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was probably the first time that Indigenous peoples in Canada became involved in doing research themselves for themselves and developed some important ethical approaches and really started the discourse on reconciliation, which has continued to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted in 2007 by the United Nations, and Canada became a signatory in 2010. And I wanted to acknowledge, of course, that in British Columbia, this has become legislation, and it only happened last year, but BC, I believe, is leading the way in thinking about the examination of the particular laws in our province and how they align, or how they should align, with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that is, we still continue today that we have the National Inquiry on Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and we have to really take seriously the calls to justice that are part of this national inquiry. So you could see that over the years, you know, different attempts have been made, and Indigenous people have become very engaged in trying to make systemic change and to put forward recommendations that really relate to notions of reconciliation. Now we enter this in the hands back, hands forward phase of putting this into action, putting our thoughts into action. Many people in various sectors, organizations, and educational levels have worked on aspects of reconciliation to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples and to create responsive contexts and approaches for education. Revitalization and understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems have occurred through educational programs, and more Indigenous people are involved in planning, developing materials, teaching, and engaging in research, and taking on important decision-making roles. And that we have an increasing number of non-Indigenous allies who are working with Indigenous peoples, so that the outcome is high quality education, that we're not focusing on a deficit mindset, that we're not starting from the position that there's something wrong with Indigenous learners, that they need to be fixed up, but we're starting, you know, from a place where we want Indigenous learners to flourish, to have success, where we want to have success in our educational institutions that are built upon Indigenous ways of knowing and being, you know, that will facilitate the growth and success for everyone. So I want to move now to sharing a few resources for those who are wondering, what can I do? You know, is there a program in a certain discipline or a certain area? So today we have some sources, you know, of information where resources and approaches are shared. And so we'll try and see if our technology is working today, which not quite here. Sorry, I'm just gonna quickly go back here and see. Oops. There, I think we're all set. Sorry about that, just took a minute to get this website on. And this one is from the National Center for Collaboration on Indigenous Education. And this website is hosted by the First Nations University of Canada, and where a team of people across Canada have collected stories of success in Indigenous education at all levels. So if you were wanting to know what's happening in post-secondary education, you could then click on post-secondary education, see what people, what language they're using when they talk about their approaches, and take a look at what's happening. And here you'd see where the various examples are located in Canada. Then you could scroll down and there are video and audio clips of people talking about their different programs in that relate to, well, here's science and education, here's elders involvement. You know, there are different language programs. There are land-based programs. So there are many different types of resources that you can find. I won't go to the BC Ministry of advanced ed, but on that website there are case studies of practices that lead to success that are Indigenous based. And I want to go to this one from Thompson Rivers University, where Dr. Shelley Johnson holds the Canada Research Chair in Indigenizing Higher Education. And on this website, there are particular resources where you can find books, articles, and various descriptions of programs. So in one sense, we have a good foundation of resources which can help us get going if we need to have such help. I'm going to move on to an area which I think is also very important, that we need to think about changing the universities. And I'll use this example that comes from UBC and its recent Indigenous strategic plan that was announced in the fall. And the important part about this is that this strategic plan uses the UNDRIP, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls to action, and the murdered missing Indigenous women and girls calls to justice as a framework. And UBC had spent a fair amount of time getting feedback from Indigenous communities, the Musqueam community, Okanagan peoples for the Okanagan campus, and many other Indigenous people, and asking internally and gathering their perspectives and voices, and their plan is to take a look at current UBC policies and see how they could align to the framework that's shown here on this slide. And I think if UBC can do it, a big university, comprehensive, quite conservative in some ways, but also leading edge in others, that I think any university can do this to change their systemic approaches. I want to move on to impact on students, and I'll show a video clip, and this comes from the University of the Fraser Valley, and it's a group of social work students sharing their experiences. And I used this as an example to show where an instructor teaching a social work course provided, I think, a good quality experience for students to learn more about, in a way, impact of colonial policy, but also to better understand what land acknowledgement means, so it stays meaningful, and doesn't just become a platitude.
None of us are from an Indigenous background, and so we were really aware of that and wanted to do it in a way that was anti-racist, that was not tokenizing the community, and it was our hope was that it would come across in a real, genuine, authentic way.
The Truth and Reconciliation recommendation, it came from South Africa, it came from the apartheid regime. So for me, it impacted me. There was a lot of history connection. I knew about the residential school, but then at a deeper level, understanding how systematic policies are still present, right, in social work and in our community. So there's a lot of knowledge that I'm leaving with, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to make some changes.
I think this topic was important for us as a group because we felt like it wasn't talked about enough, and not everyone had heard or understood what unceded territory meant, and we felt like that was an important topic. And for me personally, I feel so lucky to be on this land, to have my education on this land.
All that has happened in the past, when we say the 60s coup, the residential schools, the Indian Act, prior to that in high school, I did not know about any of this, and I did not understand the impact and magnitude it has on today, and how those processes continue to be a part of society still even today.
The more I learn about Indigenous theories like post-colonial theory, you really understand that the land is the basis of everything. And so having the acknowledgement of the land is really the first step in being able to move forward.
So now I'm going to move to the hands forward part of this presentation, where I'm going to focus on you, those who are participating in this session today. That's what I mean by my, it's really you. But I also think about my own, what are my reconciliation actions? I have shared a little about my own story and introduced a little bit about how education made me feel about my indigeneity. But I was lucky to have elders and family and others, you know, who provided a good sense of my Stalo identity. And that I think that helped me persist and succeed in educational systems. This part asks you to do the hard work first. By engaging in critical reflections about what you have learned about Indigenous peoples, and to think about how education has shaped your perspectives about indigeneity. If we were doing this in person and had more time, you know, we'd have time to think about this. I give some time of silence just to think about this. And maybe those of you who feel like adding something in the chat, maybe you could add some of your perspectives for that. And then we'd also talk about, you know, what could I do in my role at KPU for reconciliation? And I hope that you'll take some time to think about what's your story? What's your story in relation to what you have learned about Indigenous peoples? And to think how education has shaped your perspectives. And for those of you who are educators, to think about the kind of education you are going to provide, even in the way that you could support the education that's happening at KPU. How can that education move reconciliation forward for high quality education? This is my concluding slide. So I think it is important that each one of us act. We can do something in whatever role we are in. And a first step maybe for some is to learn about some of that colonial history, the laws, the policies that I had showed earlier. And it's fairly easy today to find information, you know, about what those laws and policies were about. But I'd encourage you to start with the resources that Indigenous people have developed. So in that way, I believe each one of us can do something. We can have a starting point, which I hope continues on a marvelous journey, which it has been for me. And then I want to end with some thoughts for KPU as a university too, because I think there are many who are part of this session today who can have and all of us really can have impact on making sure KPU as a university is responsive to good approaches to reconciliation. And in order for that to happen, I strongly believe that we need to have Indigenous community direction, and especially the direction that comes from the Indigenous communities that KPU serves. And that this direction and the relationships, though, must be based on principles of Indigenous self-determination and also a human rights perspective, i.e. UNDRIP. And that in doing the reconciliation work, we can each do something, but I also believe it is important that we can collectively do a lot more. And that requires partnerships amongst oops. Okay. There, I think I was just cut off there. Sorry, but I'm going to keep going, hoping that this is fine. That we have, we can do this through partnerships, and that we need to have sustained commitment. KPU can continue to live up to its name of Kwantlen, which means tireless runner, and keep living up to the university's motto, through tireless effort, knowledge, and understanding, then reconciliation can move forward. And it is moving forward, I believe, to systemic change, that any university, but I think especially KPU, since we're focusing on that today, that we need to look at what will facilitate the success, what will make Indigenous students flourish, and what systemic changes are needed for that to happen. And the same would go for all students learning about indigeneity. And also, if we need to have more Indigenous faculty and staff, that's important. And that can be seen as inclusion, which was the framework of Gaudry was presented earlier. But it's, you know, we're talking about inclusion as important, but it's not the end, that we have to think of systemic change to policies and to various approaches so that we can have success of Indigenous people within a university system. And that in the end, in doing these things, I believe we can have, you know, reconciliation that is meaningful, that is good quality, you know, and that will result in, you know, better understandings amongst all people. And so I thank KPU for the opportunity today to share my perspectives and experiences about reconciliation. So, Haichuk, all my relations.
Well, thank you, Dr. Archibald. Thank you, Joanne. Your comments, your advice, ideas, and resources that you shared this afternoon are informative, important, and thought-provoking. Your presentation will form the basis for a great dialogue, which is to follow with our panel members. It will also serve us well for our future at KPU. And we all think about our own stories, and you are encouraging us to share our stories and to think about our place in the history and how we can assist and work together to move forward. So thank you again, Joanne. I know we've worked together at UBC, yes, and it's a pleasure to hear your words and your wisdom once again. Haichka, to you, Joanne, on behalf of everyone here. We are going to take a very short break at this point and just give people a chance to reflect and perhaps add some questions to the Q&A tab in the Zoom function. You'll see that near the bottom of the screen. So I would encourage you to do that. And we will come back, it'll be 8 minutes. We'll come back at 10 after 2 o'clock. So please enjoy your break. And if you do want to add some questions, please go ahead now. Okay. I'm pleased to welcome everyone back. I hope that you had a good but very short break. Once again, I'm Dr. Steve Cardwell, Vice President of Students, and we're now going to move to the second half of our program this afternoon. And it gives me great pleasure and honor to reintroduce Dr. Davis, President Davis. I'd like to pass it to you now to introduce the panel and begin the panel discussion. Thank you.
Steve, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it. So you don't need to see me as long as you can hear me. Now they're allowing me back in. Good, thank you. Thank you. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Joanne. And let's move on to our panelists. I'm delighted to welcome 3 members of our KPU community. Our Chancellor, Kim Baird, Kuntil Tanot, is an accomplished leader, a great advocate for Indigenous people and their communities, and widely recognized for her work. She's also a distinguished alumna of KPU. In her role as KPU's 3rd Chancellor, we know her achievements will inspire and support our students and graduates in many ways. Kim was the elected chief of the Swasin First Nation for 6 terms from 1999 to 2012. She negotiated and implemented British Columbia's first urban modern treaty, which came into effect in April 29. This has provided unprecedented benefits and opportunities for the Swasin First Nation, and Kim's leadership has contributed to it being one of the most progressive First Nations in the country. Welcome, Kim. Rhiannon Bennett is a member of the Board of Governors, and she's been working with children, youth, and families for over 20 years in a variety of roles. And professionally, she has worked with Indigenous youth and families, with overarching themes of her work being decolonization and reconciliation. In 2014, she was the first Indigenous person elected to the Delta Board of Education. And as an appointed community member of KPU's Board of Governors, she is a wonderful and engaged colleague. Welcome, Rhiannon. And Samantha Jack is a KPU student. She's currently in her 4th year of studies in political science. She's played an active role in service to KPU, where she founded the Indigenous Student Council and involved in the Indigenous Advisory Committee, as well as the President's Diversity and Equity Committee. She's just completed a term as an elected student member of KPU's Board of Governors. Welcome, Samantha. I'm going to first ask the panelists to each respond with their initial thoughts and comments in response to Dr. Archibald's presentation in the order that I introduced you. Kim first, Rhiannon second, Samantha third. And I'm just going to hand it over to you, and we'll start with Kim.
Thank you so much. And I guess I just get through a little bit of protocol here. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Tsawwassen Treaty Lands. I'd like to thank Lakaten for starting us off in a good way. And thanks to all the organizers for making today possible. And thanks for including me in such an important dialogue. Thanks, Dr. Archibald, for a very thoughtful presentation about real pragmatic strategies for keeping reconciliation and indigenization at the forefront of our thinking as higher education institutions. I'm the new kid on the block at KPU, and know that there's a lot of other people who have put in a lot of effort and work on these topics on behalf of KPU, and I look forward to learning from my new colleagues about those efforts, and looking forward to collaborating on what is potential for KPU going forward in relation to these spaces. And I think, Joanne, you've really provided some a good starting point for what KPU can think about in its planning horizon. So, Haichika. I guess I pass it to Rhiannon.
Haichika. OCMCAT, Aichna Squalwan Ziquitsnala, Antha Rhiannon, Tlitsna Humasquiam, KPU Board of Governors, Etsan Shleni. My dear friends and relatives, it gives me really good feelings to see you all here today and to see all of your little names on the list there. My name is Rhiannon. I am from Musqueam and as well a governor at KPU. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I also want to acknowledge that I'm just down the road from Cam on the Tsawwassen Treaty lands. And raise my hands for Lakeaton for starting that stuff in such a good way, and gratitude as well for the organizers and such a thoughtful presentation from Dr. Archibald. Yeah, Alan, are we just doing quick introductions, or are we responding to?
You can carry on and respond. That would be great.
So I like a few things like stood out for me through the presentation and reflecting on like the work that I've been doing and the places and spaces that I've been getting into, and just really recognizing that that a lot of Canadians aren't ready for reconciliation. I find that a lot of Canadians try to step in at step 100 without having done a lot of the unlearning and learning that needs to happen to engage in meaningful reconciliation. I believe that we're many years away from what something might look like reconciliation. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to happen in the meantime, and particularly around Canadians learning about the truth of these lands. Like, I think that a lot of Canadians are uncomfortable by the truth. So we've talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They like jumped over the truth and like, let's get to work at reconciliation, and haven't paused to hear and learn and reflect on the truth. And a lot of what I find in education is that a lot of that truth is like shoved onto Indigenous people to do the work, where a lot of things that were done to us get pulled out of curriculum, get pulled out of subjects, and get put into special classes, get put into special streams, where like where residential schools becomes an Indigenous issue or history, when that's something that was done to us. And those schools were Canadian government policies, and those subjects and learning about those schools should very much be housed in Canadian history and taught about by Canadians. It shouldn't be an expectation that survivors should have to come in and teach about Canadian history. Like that's the work that Canadians need to do. And it's like a big hot potato that no one wants to touch, right? Like I don't want to touch that. Like let's make the Indigenous people talk about all the bad things that were done to them, instead of Canadians standing and owning their own history and saying, this is what our government did, this is what my ancestors did, this is what's happened here. Because it's such a contradiction from the narrative of the Canadian identity, right? Like Canadians hold so tightly to the idea of being polite and being nice and being global peacekeepers. And that's just not the experience for many Indigenous people. And thinking about, like, there was a comment in the video about like apartheid, and apartheid was based off of the Indian Act and the reserve system. So like how much of of the things that Canadians claim to be in opposition to, and how many things that Canadians claim to oppose, how many things that Canadians have gone to war for that have actually been inspired by Canada and Canadian law. So that's like the mucky truth that Canadians just want to jump over and get to. Let's all talk about all the fun things about the beautiful things of Indigenous people. But the consumption of Indigenous culture is not the pathway to reconciliation, in my perspective. You cannot harmonize the harm away. You cannot harmonize the pain away. You cannot harmonize the relationships when there's still active harm happening. And I'm really grateful that that Dr. Archibald brought up like the slide about the resistance and the resilience, because I think that's something that's not spoken about enough, that people are too ignorant on Indigenous resistance that has never stopped. You hear a lot of Canadians like, oh, you only care about that now, because they've never heard about all of the things that we've done to resist. So just because you haven't heard about Indigenous resistance doesn't mean that it has never stopped. You know, thinking about our chiefs, our late chiefs that went all the way to England to plead our cases, and that's not talked about. And I think we'll probably get to some more of it in the questions and answers, but I have some, one more part that I just wanted to get to is really highlight as well what Dr. Archibald had mentioned about things being Indigenous led and our right to self-determination, that those relationships are so important between institutions and the people of the land, and those relationships take work. There's a lot of mistrust between those communities for very, very valid reasons. And you need to do a lot of work on yourself before you're ready to sit at the table to build those relationships. And just maybe like two more quick points here before I pass it over to my dear friend Samantha with the beautiful artwork by my cousin Jody Wilson in the background there. So Indigenous education is become like an umbrella word. And I find that people are just sort of using it interchangeably in places where they shouldn't. So like Indigenous education is like the overarching like word, but it looks different for different groups of people. So there's Indigenous education that needs to happen for educators. There's Indigenous education that needs to happen for students. But there's also Indigenous education for ourselves, for Indigenous people, that we still have the right to have spaces by ourselves. We still have the right to gather in safety and to be together. So I find that like right now, a worrying trend is how all of that is trying to happen in the same space at the same time. And you can't do that. Like, I think it's very, I don't think it's very helpful or for an Indigenous student to be in a classroom learning about themselves in front of other people. Like I think about like how much shame or embarrassment or confusion that could carry for students when there's someone there and their classmates are all turning and looking at them like, tell me about this and tell me about that. Like we need spaces where we can have those conversations and have those teachings and learnings just to ourselves as well. Maybe I'll save my other point for later and I'll turn it back over to Samantha for now. Thank you.
Hi, Samantha.
Chichi Mayakwa, Uklama Samantha Jack. Hello, I'm Samantha Jack. I'm from Nuchanoth and Yale First Nations. My father's family is the Johnson's family in Muchalet of Nuchanoth. And my mother's family is the Jack family of Ruby Creek. And I'm really, really happy to be here. And I wanted to extend a warm thank you and just gratitude for being here, but also Dr. Archibald for your presentation and to everyone who made this possible. I'm very honored and humbled to be here with you today. And I am coming to you from the unceded Tsawwassen territories here in White Rock area. Um, from the wonderful presentation, it really did have hit some reflections with me and my experience as a student here with KPU. When we discussed resiliency in the presentation, it really reminded me of, yes, we always talk about systemic harm and systemic racism, but we also forget to talk about systemic hope and what that means to our peoples, hope for our next 7 generations. And that's something that isn't discussed, because we're still navigating that as we try and, you know, reconcile within ourselves about our own indigeneity. And bringing it back to Indigenous education, like what Rhiannon was saying, I think it's very important. My experience as an Indigenous student, it has been in those very classrooms, having those hard conversations, having those uncomfortable moments where, yes, we're talking about something that needs to be talked about, but we're doing it in an unsafe way. And the way to move forward is to make those classes safe, to have those conversations for other people, but it's also about protecting the students. And that's super, super important, especially within a higher learning institution. Because in order to have this decolonization or reconciliation and have it implemented and be effective, we need to address all that goes with it. We need to address the harmful history. We need to address the harmful assumptions and beliefs that are perpetuated within society. And we need to, from our understandings and from what we've learned as Indigenous people, but also Canadians learning from society, we need to disrupt that. And that's what happens, and that's what needs to happen in classrooms, is we need to disrupt the acceptance and normalization of these beliefs, of these behaviors and assumptions that create harm for Indigenous students, Indigenous communities that, you know, we live with. And that's kind of what I would like to discuss. So I wanted to say thank you. We'll pass it back to Ann.
Yeah, thanks so much. Kim, was there anything you wanted to say before I asked Joanne to respond?
Sure. I mean, I'm a bit overwhelmed with the download of ideas that are coming across through the questions and answers and through my fellow panelists. And I just want to say that Dr. Archibald's experience resonates with me about how she learned about the impacts of colonization, because it was the same process I had to go through to learn about it. And I guess I also agree with Rhiannon's comments about the lack of public awareness on these issues is a huge barrier, I guess, to reconciliation. And until that work that Dr. Archibald refers to, us doing our own work, until that's done across the country, it is hard to see how the public will be ready for the type of changes that are needed for Indigenous communities. And I think there's lots of competing ideas about the way forward, and some people feel that they're right ways and wrong ways, or competing ideas, whether it's decolonization versus reconciliation. I think Samantha's right, though, that there is no agreement on any of these concepts writ large by anybody, that there needs to be safe spaces for people to learn about these issues and discuss these issues, whether it be internally for Indigenous people or whether it be Canadians to Indigenous people. And I think where I land on is, I think that post-secondary institutions such as KPU can have a pivotal role in providing safe spaces for those discussions and providing a way forward for people being able to do their own work, I guess, would be some of my additional comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Joanne, did you want to respond to the panelists' first response, and then we can throw it open to other questions?
Sure. Well, it's such a pleasure to see, Rihanna, Kim, Samantha, and please call me Joanne. There. So I really value your comments, and this is a really important, and it's a challenging area. And where I think if we are, since KPU is sponsoring this, that we can say there are things here at KPU, and I think, Samantha, we need to start with the students to get a sense of, what would make Indigenous students comfortable. And I know what you mean when, there is in the class discussions, sometimes, it can be hostile or just uncomfortable. And, Indigenous students, yes, are often looked at as the experts, and that means others, like the instructor and other students, don't take on that responsibility. So I think it's, important that the university do something to help instructors, help them create, an atmosphere that is safe for people to talk about ideas, but they're not attacking their personhood, because you often feel like that as an Indigenous person, and that, we need to do that hard work first, of thinking about ourselves and, what has influenced us, then to get a sense of how can we listen to each other, and learn from each other. And those may seem like simple things, but they're so hard, they're complex. But if people make a commitment to do it, if the university makes a commitment to help faculty members provide this atmosphere and provide, other supports, and to share the successes and the challenges. And, I think that's important. What I think is the worst thing is if we have to feel like we are in this alone, right? But we're not today. There are so many at KPU that are there to help. And, the dear elders who started our session today, Cheryl and LaCaiton, the community, Kim and Rhiannon are part of, give good direction, I believe, to KPU. So there are people out there. So, I think that, there's a good basis of work going forward. But it does mean, I believe, the university has to make a commitment to say reconciliation is important for all of us at the university, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of sort of questions to kick off with, and I'll go to the Q&A list here. Honorable Senator and Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, who was Chief Commissioner of the TRC, said the following, paraphrasing a bit: in broad terms, education has been the primary tool of oppression of Aboriginal people and miseducation of all Canadians. But education holds the key to making things better. So in the tone of sort of systemic hope, as you mentioned, Samantha, do you share his optimism about education putting us on a better path without overlooking the hard truths of what has occurred, doing all the hard work? Do you think there is a strong possibility of prevailing, or is it still up in the air?
We're all going to be like super respectful of each other. So we're all going to wait politely for our elder or someone to speak, Alan. So you might want to direct and invite some people, or we'll all just very politely sit here and smile at you.
Well, you're okay. Thank you. Thank you. Well, why don't you start since you have the floor?
Thank you. I do believe that education is the key to this. I remember when I got elected to the Delta School Board, I didn't cross that magic line until the very last poll of the night reported, and I crossed the line by seven votes. 7 votes was the only thing that pushed me over the line. And when I stood and spoke to the people that had gathered to watch the results coming together, I remember telling everybody, you know, that education was used as a weapon of genocide, and was used such a strong pointed tool and weapon of genocide, that now we need to shift that, and education should always be something that provides equity and opportunity. So again, it goes back to like my remark earlier about that I agree with what Senator has said, but I think that people need to remember like all of what he means by that it's not just education for Canadians about who we are as Indigenous people, but it's about education, like the education that people received in residential schools was subpar. It was very much, we weren't valued, we weren't expected to be anything. So there's education that needs to come, like we need better access to education as Indigenous people, but also like the education of the educators. Like all of the educators that are out there right now have been educated in a system that has perpetuated white supremacy, has perpetuated, 4-year-old playing with a lightsaber in the background, if you can hear that.
Yes.
My young Jedi warrior here comes, here she comes now. So, yes. So, Delta's gonna have a fun time when she gets there next September. So like the thing, like in regards to like the educators, so because the educators have so much work to do, like there's been this big system change. Can you turn that off, baby? Like with the recent changes to the curriculum here in BC, there's been a system change. But what the province has failed to do is to change the components of the system. So all of the educators that are now expected to behave in this new changed system haven't been brought along. So they're expected to deliver a new curriculum that they haven't been adequately prepared to deliver. There's, in my perspective, there's 4 types of educators. There's educators who are frozen by fear and do nothing. They're so afraid of making a mistake that they don't change or learn or do anything. There's the deniers of, the deniers that there needs to be any change. So those are the people who are entrenched in their white supremacy and entrenched in their colonial beliefs, who are still educating from that perspective. And then there are the people who are also doing harm, who get a little bit of knowledge and run away with it, but don't cite their sources, that really perpetuate a lot of pan-Indigenous perspectives, which is also incredibly harmful. They're also the people who suffer from white fragility, where if they're corrected on something, they have a breakdown, and they're like, but I'm an ally, but I'm this and that. And don't take that correction as a gift, don't take that correction as an opportunity, and sort of shut down about it. And then there are the ones out there who are teaching from a place of humility and grace, who are constantly checking in with elders, checking in with knowledge keepers, checking in with people, reevaluating the work and perspectives, and always deepening their learning. And coming from that place of doing things the right way. So there is a right way to do things, but when settler and white ears hear that, they like hear perfection, that I must be perfect. And that's not what doing things the right way means. Like thinking about like when we do our ceremonies here, we have our speaker on the floor, the floor manager and the family, and they're always talking amongst themselves and checking. They before they get to the floor, they have everything all mapped out about what they're going to do, but they're always doing those tiny little corrections as they go, things that got overlooked, corrections that need to be made. And sometimes they may make mistakes, but then they'll address it and fix it and carry on. Like that's doing things the right way. But it's not that all, but it's also not the caveat of just a free for all to go and make all sorts of mistakes or whatever. It's that, it's that humility that's key, right? Is constantly, the decolonization is an ongoing process. I'm constantly learning. because we're forced to communicate in a colonial language. It's hard sometimes to share those nuances of our culture in a language that's so polar opposite of who we are.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so she's given the rest of you lots of time to think about this. Are you optimistic about education being possibly the key or a key to moving ahead?
I'll pipe in and say that I think it's the prerequisite enabler of change.
Okay.
And that in my experience, while I was chief of my community, I don't know how many thousands of people during my career have had to try to educate on Indigenous matters. And the vast majority of them, once they fully understand the inadequacies of Indian Act governance, of the realities of trying to deal with the impacts of colonization, people can't unknow that. It provides a very different view of Indigenous issues in the country, whether it be poverty or all the poor statistics of overrepresentation in the justice system, poor health outcomes, low education levels, low income levels. All those things can be attributed to the impacts of colonization. And when people start to understand the systemic issues and how the things have been rigged against Indigenous people, it really opens their mind to change. In my experience, vast majority of people that I explain this to, their minds completely open. And I see just the change that's happened in my lifetime. It's astounding. That's not to say there isn't a long ways to go in this country, but I especially look at our youth and our engaged youth and how rights-oriented they are. And I mean, I have, is it systemic hope as well and optimism?
Good, thank you. Anyone else? Shall I move on? Samantha.
Yeah. I would definitely say as a student and being on the receiving ends kind of these changes and in the want for change is really, has been inspiring, has been hopeful and humbling to say as an Indigenous woman, seeing this and seeing the efforts that people, individuals and communities are making to try and make this work. And I would definitely say education is key, and not just key for, I guess, settler disruption, but also for building the capacity and confidence for Indigenous youth and Indigenous students. And that really brings it back to resilience, because with that newfound confidence and the continued education and support, we really are fostering resilience. And that's what I'd like to say.
Good. Yeah. I'm just going, anything, Joanne, did you want to say anything at this point?
No, I've already said lots. Of course, I'm always optimistic, right? So
great. Yes, you are. Yeah.
I continue to work at this, even though I'm officially retired from UBC.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it, does it? Now I'm just going to, somebody's going to send me a message. I'm in the Q&A and I'm looking at the list of questions and I'm supposed to get instructions from Natalie. Natalie, when it says answer live, is that the question you want me to ask? Is that right?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm just going to go from the top, from the order that they came in. Here's a question. It's curious about the importance of learning about the protocols that are fundamental to Indigenous teachings. How important is it that faculty learn about these protocols, and how best should they make certain this knowledge is shared with students? You want to think about that? Oh, I'm supposed to say who goes first. Joanne, do you want to respond to that first? Because
Sure.
you spend a long time working with educational providers, and what do you do about that?
Well, in answer to the question, I think it's very important, and really taking the time to establish the relationship with the elders, the cultural knowledge holders, whomever has that responsibility to share those protocols, and to remember that we're taking what are often community cultural protocols from a cultural context and putting them into, an educational institution. So we have to think of, how is that best done so it still maintains the integrity, of the values, the principles, the reasons for those protocols, but we look at the practice of them. And I think we can only do that in partnership with the community people to have a sense of what the protocols are and to learn them and to keep teaching them and then to practice them. And, I know if we have, do this with our good heart and mind and establish a relationship, there are times when we might make a mistake. And I heard Cheryl talk about, dear Elder Cheryl, talk about this when she said, I remember her saying that we sometimes, yes, we make a mistake, but we apologize, but then we are determined that next time I'm going to do better. Okay, so then you figure out what's next time. So to me, that was, again, very hopeful that yes, we will make mistakes, but we can apologize and we could figure out what was the mistake and do better next time.
Good. Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in on that one? We have lots of other questions. Rianne.
I'll just add quick, just that in building those relationships, I think it's important to spend a fair bit of time working on addressing your own internalized white supremacy and biases. Because when you're still listening through that lens and listening with those ears, sometimes you miss what's being shared with you. So it's really important sort of to learn how to recognize that in yourself and to learn how to listen deeply and how to learn to do those things before you try and build those relationships or spend a lot of time there. Like there's a lot of work that has to happen before that relationship gets developed.
Thank you.
I'll just quickly add that I think that knowledge of protocols is important and that they have a time and a place. And if you're taught about all aspects of them, you will know that. And the reason why I think that's important is, and I work with lots of other groups on this stuff, is that it can't be a checklist. It can't, like, intentionality is everything when you're doing this kind of work. And if you are doing a land acknowledgement, but you have no idea of what it means, then it's really a meaningless gesture. So I think the key is ensuring that tools are in place for people to learn the underpinning values and teachings so that they aren't just putting a thread in their email that has no real meaning to them. They're not connected to it. They don't understand it. So thinking about those things comprehensively is important, I think.
Thank you. Samantha?
Yeah, that's really important. And back to the relationships. Relationships are built on trust, but they're also built on accountability. And when it comes to protocol, what's so vital to remember is that although you have been taught this or it has been shared with you, you should seek permission. Am I doing this correctly? And that is where the accountability comes in hand. It's important to hold ourselves responsible to our relationships and to one another. And when it comes to protocol, that is probably the first step I would advise is make sure you ask what you're allowed to share, because our culture is not always available for display purposes, if that makes sense. So it's always very important to understand the difference between knowledge that is shared with you and knowledge that is given to you.
Yes. Thank you. Oh, I'm getting, what did she say here? Okay, yeah. I've got a complicated system here of instructions about which questions are, okay, Natalie would like to answer this question live. Okay, so this is about decolonization cannot be addressed without recognizing and reconciling the practical and ecological impact settlers have had on the land. And I think this is about KPU has certain land assets. What is KPU doing pragmatically to ensure the physical lands that we regularly acknowledge our work is taking place on, that is the region we work and study on, will be viable, resilient, and sustainable spaces for future generations, and not a paved paradise of academic infrastructure? So I think it's that sounds like an internal question, and we're just going through this fairly long and complicated kind of long-term campus planning process. And as part of that, we want to make sure, and there's been a lot of comments from a lot of people who have been involved in that, to the effect that we need to reflect the Indigenous heritage of the lands that we hold in trust in many ways. I don't know that there's much else to say about it. Certainly as it comes forward, and certainly Kim and Rhiannon and Samantha will see the results of our work and how we're trying to link the future of the lands that we are holding in trust. And also, there's also a sustainability committee that takes great interest in anything that we do. So we have a fairly transparent process, and there's a lot of activity. I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but perhaps you can just reflect on that in terms of KPU's stewardship over the actual land that it professes to be operating on, the land of your ancestors. Does that make any sense? Am I making the question answerable? Kim, you've done a lot of work with land. I don't know how, and it's hard because it's hard to sort of understand while we're in this environment to be able to sort of, if we were on the land, we could kind of talk about it more, but it's a bit tricky. We have 5 campuses now. Kim, do you have anything?
So not fully understanding the strategic planning that's done so far and how integrated Indigenous issues are into it. I can say I'm sure we can do better.
Oh yeah.
So, as Chancellor, I hope that, we can engage with the communities, the First Nation communities our campuses are within the territories of, and really work on building those relationships to ensure that there is respect shown, and that we listen to issues communities raise, and really hope that people from those communities will be attending KPU to inform us as well. So I think it should be an iterative process, but while I'm in my capacity, certainly would like to lead some outreach to the communities.
Yes, it'd be very valuable. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Can I just add?
Please,
I appreciate the sentiment of that question, and it's important to recognize that work around reconciliation, decolonization, whatever phrasing you want to use, has to include conversations about the land. We are connected to, we are a part of, you can't do, the land has to come with those rebuilding of those relationships. And I think if people want to go and sort of explore that more, that's one of the underlying issues that makes Canadians really uncomfortable, is when we start talking about land and land back and reconciliation, decolonization with the land. It makes people very afraid. And we can't separate the liberation and justice for Indigenous people without conversations including the land and resources as well. So if you were to go and to do a search about how, like, the Canadian media reports on stories about Black Lives Matter and the resurgence of that this summer, you'll find that all of the news reports talk about racial justice and racial justice and the movement for equity. But then you go and Google articles about land back and articles about Wet'suwet'en and articles about shut down Canada, and it's a very different tone. It talks about protesters, it talks about terrorists, it talks about all sorts of things, and there's no mention of racial justice. Like the Canadians work very hard to keep those two issues separate, and they are not.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Let's see. Trying to click between screens here, excuse me. Let me try another one here. This is interesting, and I think it's an honest question. What's the difference between reconciliation and decolonization for you? Can you give some examples of practices that might fit into either category? Oh dear, here we go. You can think about that while I'm clicking around. There I am.
Maybe I'll try that one a bit.
Yeah, yes, Joanne, thank you.
Because I go back and forth on all this terminology, you know, about decolonization, then it was indigenization, now it's reconciliation. And not that, I mean, there are maybe some important things that maybe I've come to appreciate. And I really, though, feel the starting place is our Indigenous place, you know, and that's related to the land. Like, who are we? You know, we come from a community that's based in land, that we have stories about the mountains, the rivers, and that is who we are, our starting point as Indigenous peoples. And I guess if we're, you know, non-Indigenous, we have to think, you know, where is our place? Where do we identify? What place do we identify? What land do we identify with, if at all? And, you know, I think that, so I feel that has to always be the starting place, and we always return there somehow, at least I do. And then when you think of decolonization, I think that's doing the hard work, understanding the impact of colonization, because then we have to, the decolonize means to kind of unravel all of that to get at what was the impact. And then for Indigenous people is to understand how our languages, our traditions, our stories, you know, were impacted, were kind of covered over, and we have to uncover this colonial stuff to get at the Indigenous part. And of course, there's changes over time. So I think the decolonization is that hard work of examining who we are, what has shaped us, what is my privilege in a way, you know, and being critical about that. You know, then the idea of reconciliation maybe is how do we bring some things together that may have been disconnected or disrupted in ways, and so that's a little bit about, you know, it's something I continually think about, and of course lots of people have written about it.
Yes, yeah. Rhiannon?
I can add to that. So for me, the work of decolonization is that decentering of the Eurocentric thinking and Eurocentric lens of the world. And people are and that's a lot of work for people to do, to figure out how how that shapes their worldview. I've got a few exercises that I run through people on that when I do my decolonization workshops, but it's learning how to shift your perspective away from that Eurocentric white supremacist worldview. That's sort of like the work for non-Indigenous people around decolonization. Indigenous people, we have our own personal work to do around decolonization. That's different. That's about language and culture reclamation and things like that, which is like more or different than what the non-Indigenous people need to work on. And then reconciliation, like that's the rebuilding of relationships. Like that's a relational project, whereas that decolonization is really that individual work about how we turn our thinking upside down and start to see the world. Like in particular, so for those of you on the who are listening who might speak more than one language, I find like a really common thing to do is people will come and go, how do you say this phrase in Hunkaminam? Just a minute, babe. How do you say this phrase in Hunkaminam? But there's no context of culture, right? So our culture is embedded in our language. So you cannot just do straight translation from one language to another language. It doesn't work. So I find that that's what's the sort of the stumbling block right now, is that Canadians still want to be that Eurocentric way, but somehow have an Indigenous translation through it, and it just doesn't work. Like we need to shift away from that Eurocentric thinking.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. It's 3:01. I'm going to take the advice of my team here. Are we good for another question or one more question? People are probably going to drop off because at KPU we have meetings back to back all day. So I'm just wondering what I should do here. Should I close it off and invite Natalie to thank our panelist and speaker? Somebody. Okay, I'm going to respect people's time because it is 3 o'clock and I think that people are dropping off already and they have to go. But and you've given us a huge gift here with your time and your thoughts, and it surpassed any expectations that I had. And I hope that's true also of the participants. There's some wonderful comments that have come in on the chat line. But so thank you very much on behalf of the university, but I'm going to ask Natalie Wood-Weens to just finish the program and say goodbye to people. Natalie?
Hello, sorry, my clicker gets stuck sometimes and I have to double click. So yes, thank you so much, Alan. I just want to take the opportunity to first acknowledge that I am situated on the unceded territories of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Semiahmoo First Nations. And I just want to give a huge shout out to Joanne. It's lovely to see you again. It's been a bit of time since we last saw one another. And also thank all the panelists. Kim, look forward to working with you in your role as Chancellor. Samantha, we've lost touch for a bit, but I hope that we reconnect once again soon. And then Rhiannon, it's lovely to meet you. I know we met on during the advisory committee. And I'd also like to thank, obviously, my colleagues, Steve and Romy, working together on this initiative, which I thought was extremely critical to move forward and the start of our dialogue series. And of course, our incredible behind the scenes team who helped with all the technical pieces, Samantha Daniels, Corey Langloy, Par Marar, Amanda Nasiri, Nicole Poole, and Simon Chu. And also, last but not least, I'd like to thank all the participants who shared the afternoon with us. And just in closing, I'd like to go back to Joanne's 2 questions as some more food for thought as you sign off and end your day. How has your education shaped your perceptions of indigeneity? And what can I do in my role towards advancing reconciliation? So on that note, I just wish everyone well, and thanks again for joining us. take care and keep well, and stay tuned for announcements on our next dialogue series, which will be out shortly. You've probably already bookmarked our page, but please check back again. And last, it was lovely to see you, Lakayton and Cheryl, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Goodbye.
Bye.